I caught my pastor drugging communion wine to molest elderly church members. My name is Dorothy Richardson and I'm 68 years old. For 42 years, I've been a faithful member of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in Cedar Grove. I've sung in the choir, organized countless bake sales, and never missed a Sunday service unless I was hospitalized. I trusted my church completely. More importantly, I trusted Pastor Michael Williams with my soul. Pastor Williams arrived at St. Matthew's 5 years ago, a charismatic man in his early 50s with silver hair and kind blue eyes. He had a gift for making everyone feel special, especially the elderly members of our congregation. He'd remember our grandchildren's names, ask about our health problems, and always had time for a comforting word. "Mrs. Richardson," he'd say with that warm smile, "you're the heart of this congregation. We're blessed to have you." The ladies in our Bible study group adored him. Helen Martinez, my closest friend and fellow widow, would blush like a schoolgirl whenever Pastor Williams complimented her hat or asked about her arthritis. "He's such a caring man," Helen would say. "Not like some pastors who just go through the motions." St. Matthew's had been struggling before Pastor Williams arrived. Our congregation was aging, donations were down, and we'd already lost half our members to newer, more modern churches. But Pastor Williams brought new life to our little church. He started special programs for seniors, organized weekly dinners, and created a sense of community we hadn't felt in years. Sunday services became the highlight of my week again. Pastor Williams had a way of making scripture feel personal and relevant. His sermons about God's love for the elderly and forgotten touched my heart deeply. But about 6 months ago, I started noticing something strange. It began with small things. Helen would seem confused after Sunday service, unable to remember parts of the sermon or how she'd gotten home. At first, I attributed it to her age. Helen was 73, and we all had our senior moments. "I must be getting old," Helen would laugh nervously. "I can't remember walking to my car yesterday." Good thing muscle memory kicked in. Then other members of our congregation started experiencing similar problems. Mrs. Peterson, 81, couldn't remember receiving communion one Sunday. Mr. Garcia, 79, told me he'd woken up in his car in the church parking lot with no memory of the service ending. "These senior moments are getting worse," Mrs. Peterson confided to me after Bible study. "Sometimes I feel like I'm losing whole chunks of time." At first, I assumed it was just the normal effects of aging. Our congregation was mostly elderly, and memory problems weren't uncommon. But the incidents seemed to be increasing in frequency, and they always happened on Sundays. The first time I really became suspicious was 3 months ago during communion. I was sitting in my usual pew, 3rd row from the front on the left side, when I noticed something odd about how Pastor Williams served the wine. For younger congregation members and families with children, he served grape juice from a silver pitcher. But for the elderly members, especially those who attended alone, he used a separate chalice filled with what he said was traditional communion wine. "This is the blood of Christ," he would say solemnly, offering the special chalice to elderly members. "Drink in remembrance of him." I'd always felt honored to receive the traditional wine. It made me feel like part of a sacred ritual that connected me to centuries of Christian worship. But that Sunday, I noticed Pastor Williams watching the elderly members who drank from his special chalice with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. After communion, Helen seemed particularly disoriented. She swayed slightly as she walked back to her pew, and I had to steady her arm. "Are you all right?" I whispered. "Just dizzy," she murmured. "Must be my blood pressure medication." But Helen's blood pressure had been well controlled for years. She'd never had problems with dizziness during church before. As the service continued, I watched Helen carefully. Her eyes seemed unfocused, and she swayed slightly in her seat. By the time Pastor Williams gave the final blessing, Helen looked almost like she was sleeping with her eyes open. After the service, I offered to drive Helen home. "That's so kind of you, Dorothy," she said, her words slightly slurred. "I don't think I should drive today. I feel so strange." As I helped Helen to her car to get her purse, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were red marks on her upper arms, like fingerprints, visible beneath her short-sleeved dress. "Helen, what happened to your arms?" I asked gently. She looked down at the marks with confusion. "I don't know. I don't remember bumping into anything." The marks looked fresh, like they'd happened within the last hour. During church service. That night I couldn't sleep. Something was very wrong at St. Matthew's. and it involved the man I'd trusted with my faith for 5 years. I started paying closer attention during the following weeks. I noticed that Pastor Williams only offered the traditional wine to elderly members who attended church alone. Widows like Helen and me. Elderly men whose spouses had passed away. People who lived by themselves and might not be missed if something happened to them. And after drinking from Pastor Williams' special chalice, these vulnerable members of our congregation would become disoriented, confused, and have gaps in their memory. I realized with growing horror that our beloved pastor might be drugging the communion wine. But why? And what was he doing to us while we were incapacitated? The thought was so terrible I could barely acknowledge it. But I knew I had to find out the truth, no matter how devastating it might be. Our congregation's most vulnerable members were in danger, and I might be the only one who could protect them. The following Sunday, I arrived at church early and positioned myself where I could observe Pastor Williams' preparations for communion. I pretended to arrange flowers at the altar while keeping one eye on the vestry where he prepared the sacraments. Pastor Williams seemed completely normal, greeting early arrivals with his usual warmth and asking about their week. But when he thought no one was watching, I saw him handle the communion elements differently than I'd ever noticed before. He had 2 chalices. One larger silver chalice that he filled with grape juice for the general congregation, and a smaller, more ornate golden chalice that he filled from a special bottle of red wine he kept locked in his desk drawer. I watched him unlock the drawer with a key he wore on a chain around his neck, hidden beneath his clerical collar. The bottle was dark glass, unmarked, unlike the regular communion wine bottles we donated from our own cellars over the years. As the service began, I paid careful attention to who received wine from which chalice. Just as I suspected, Pastor Williams only offered the special golden chalice to elderly members who attended alone. Helen was among them. As she approached the altar, Pastor Williams' demeanor changed subtly. His smile became more intense, his voice softer. "The blood of Christ shed for you," he said, tilting the golden chalice to her lips and making sure she drank deeply. I watched Helen return to her pew. Within minutes, her movements became slower, her expression vacant. By the end of the service, she was barely responsive. After the final hymn, most of the congregation filed out quickly, eager to get to Sunday dinner. But several elderly members who'd received communion from the special chalice remained in their pews, apparently disoriented or unable to move normally. "Mrs. Martinez seems a bit tired today," Pastor Williams announced to the few remaining congregation members. "I'll make sure she gets home safely. You all go ahead." I lingered, pretending to gather my things slowly while keeping an eye on what happened next. Pastor Williams approached Helen, who was sitting motionless in her pew, staring straight ahead with glassy eyes. "Helen," he said gently, placing his hand on her shoulder, "let me help you to your car." But instead of leading her toward the parking lot, Pastor Williams guided Helen toward the back of the church, toward his private office. My heart began racing. This was wrong. Very wrong. I waited until they disappeared, then quietly followed. The church was nearly empty now, just a few stragglers chatting in the foyer. I slipped down the hallway toward Pastor Williams' office. The door was closed, but I could hear voices inside. Pastor Williams was speaking in low, soothing tones. "Just rest, Helen. You're safe here. Just close your eyes and rest." I pressed my ear to the door, trying to hear more. Helen's voice was barely audible, slurred and confused. I don't feel right," she mumbled. "What's happening?" "Sure," Pastor Williams replied. "Everything's fine. You just need to lie down for a moment." I heard movement inside the office. The sound of furniture being moved. Then silence. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, I heard the office door handle turn. I quickly ducked into the ladies' room across the hall and left the door slightly ajar so I could see. Pastor Williams emerged from his office, looking around to make sure the hallway was empty. He straightened his collar and smoothed his hair, then walked back toward the sanctuary. A few minutes later, Helen appeared in the hallway. She was walking unsteadily, her clothes disheveled, her hair messed up. She looked around in confusion, as if she didn't know where she was. I waited until Pastor Williams was gone, then approached Helen. "Helen? Are you all right?" She turned to me with unfocused eyes. "Dorothy? What? Where am I?" "You're at church, honey. The service just ended." "The service?" Helen touched her forehead with shaking fingers. "I don't remember. How did I get here?" I helped Helen to her car, my mind racing with terrible possibilities. Her clothes were wrinkled in a way that suggested someone had been handling her. There were new red marks on her wrists, faint but visible. Helen, what's the last thing you remember from today? I remember communion, she said slowly. Pastor Williams gave me wine. It tasted strange, bitter. And then, she trailed off looking lost. And then what? Nothing. I don't remember anything after that. Over the next 2 weeks, I started keeping detailed notes of everything I observed. I documented which congregation members received wine from the special chalice, and I followed up with them during the week to ask about their experience. The pattern was consistent and horrifying. Elderly members who drank from Pastor Williams' special communion wine experienced memory loss, disorientation, and physical symptoms that suggested they'd been drugged. Many reported waking up in strange places with no memory of how they'd gotten there. Mrs. Peterson told me she'd found herself in the church basement after one service, with no memory of going downstairs. Her blouse had been buttoned wrong. Mr. Garcia said he'd regained awareness in the church parking lot, sitting in his car with the keys in his hand, but couldn't remember driving there or even leaving the sanctuary. Eleanor Watts, a quiet widow in her 70s, confided that she'd awakened on the couch in Pastor Williams' office after a service, feeling sick and disoriented. When she'd asked Pastor Williams what happened, he'd told her she'd fainted during communion and he'd let her rest. But Eleanor didn't remember fainting. She remembered drinking the communion wine, feeling dizzy, and then nothing until she woke up on that couch with her dress twisted and her undergarments uncomfortable. The most disturbing conversation was with Margaret Foster, an 80-year-old woman who lived alone. Margaret was usually sharp as a tack, but she'd been having episodes after Sunday services for months. I keep finding things that don't belong to me, she told me over tea one Wednesday afternoon. Personal things. Undergarments that aren't mine. I find them in my purse or my coat pockets, and I have no idea how they got there. Margaret showed me what she'd found. Women's underwear that was clearly not hers, in different sizes and styles. The implications made me sick to my stomach. Margaret, when did you first start having these memory problems? About 6 months ago, she said. Right around the time Pastor Williams started offering that special communion wine to us older members. He said it was a blessing reserved for the faithful who'd served the church longest. I realized with growing horror that Pastor Williams had been systematically drugging and assaulting the most vulnerable members of our congregation for months. Elderly women and men who lived alone, who had no one to notice changes in their behavior or ask questions about their whereabouts. He'd used our trust, our faith, and our isolation against us. He'd turned the most sacred ritual of our church into a weapon to prey upon the elderly. But I still needed proof. Something concrete that would convince the authorities and protect the other victims. It was time to set a trap for the wolf in sheep's clothing who'd been hiding behind the altar at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. Planning my investigation required careful thought. Pastor Williams was intelligent and manipulative. If he suspected I was onto him, he might change his methods or worse, target me directly. I needed concrete evidence before I could act. My grandson Jake worked in computer security and had taught me how to use my smartphone to record videos discreetly. Just press this button, Grandma, and it records even if the screen looks turned off, he'd shown me. I never thought I'd use that knowledge to catch a predator. The next Wednesday evening, I volunteered to stay after Bible study to help clean the sanctuary. This would give me access to the church when Pastor Williams prepared for Sunday service. That's so thoughtful of you, Dorothy, Pastor Williams said with his practiced smile. You're always going above and beyond for our church family. The words made my skin crawl now. His church family was just a hunting ground for vulnerable prey. I waited until Pastor Williams was in his office, then slipped into the vestry where the communion elements were stored. My hand shook as I examined the special bottle he used for the golden chalice. It was kept in a locked drawer, but I noticed the lock was simple and old. Using a hairpin technique my late husband had taught me during his brief career as a locksmith, I managed to open the drawer. Inside was the dark bottle, along with several small vials containing clear liquid with no labels. I used my phone to take pictures of everything, making sure to capture the vials clearly. Whatever was in those containers, it wasn't communion wine. As I photographed the evidence, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Pastor Williams was coming back. I quickly closed the drawer, but in my haste I didn't lock it properly. The mechanism clicked audibly just as the vestry door opened. Dorothy? Is everything all right in here? Pastor Williams stood in the doorway, his kind expression flickering with something else for just a moment. Suspicion. "Oh, Pastor Williams," I said, trying to sound normal. "I was just looking for extra candles for Sunday. The altar looks a bit bare." He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the vestry. Did he notice the drawer wasn't quite flush? Could he tell someone had been tampering with his supplies? "The candles are in the storage closet," he said slowly. "You know that, Dorothy. You've been organizing our supplies for years." My heart pounded, but I forced a confused smile. Of course, silly me. I guess I'm having a senior moment. Sometimes I forget the simplest things. Pastor Williams relaxed slightly. He was used to dismissing the concerns and observations of elderly women as confusion or forgetfulness. That bias had probably helped him get away with his crimes for so long. "It happens to all of us," he said with false kindness. "Why don't you head home? I can finish up here." I left the church that night knowing my investigation had to accelerate. Pastor Williams might be suspicious now, and I couldn't risk him changing his methods before I gathered enough evidence to stop him. Saturday evening, I returned to the church for what I told the night security guard was one last check on the flowers for tomorrow's service. The elderly guard, Tom, had known me for years and didn't question my presence. This time I was better prepared. I brought my phone fully charged, along with a small flashlight and the proper tools to open the vestry drawer without making noise. The church was eerily quiet as I made my way to the vestry. Shadows from the stained glass windows cast colored patterns on the walls, and every small sound seemed amplified in the silence. I opened the drawer more carefully this time and removed one of the small vials containing clear liquid. Using an eyedropper I'd brought from home, I transferred a small sample into a prescription bottle I'd cleaned thoroughly. If my suspicions were correct, this liquid was some kind of drug. I could have it tested at the lab where my late husband had worked. His former colleague, Dr. Sarah Chun, still worked there and might help me identify the substance. As I prepared to leave, I heard a key turning in the main church door. Someone was entering the building who had their own access. Pastor Williams. I quickly returned the vial to the drawer, locked it, and turned off my flashlight. But where could I hide? The vestry had no other exit, and if Pastor Williams came here to prepare for tomorrow's service, he'd find me. I slipped behind the large wooden cabinet where we stored seasonal decorations. It was a tight fit, and I had to control my breathing to avoid making noise. Pastor Williams entered the vestry and went directly to the locked drawer. I heard the keychain jingle as he unlocked it. Through a small gap between the cabinet and the wall, I could see him removing the vials and examining them in the light. To my horror, he seemed to be counting them. Had he noticed that the liquid level in one vial was slightly lower? Did he know someone had taken a sample? Pastor Williams set the vials on the counter and began preparing the communion wine for tomorrow's service. I watched in disgust as he carefully measured clear liquid from 2 different vials into the dark bottle, then swirled it gently to mix the contents. He was preparing to drug multiple members of our congregation. The sight made me physically sick, but I forced myself to remain silent and keep recording with my phone. "Perfect," Pastor Williams muttered to himself. "Just the right dosage to keep them compliant but not obviously impaired." The casual way he discussed drugging elderly church members revealed the true monster behind his pastoral facade. This wasn't a crime of passion or a single mistake. This was calculated, methodical predation. Pastor Williams returned the vials to the drawer and locked it, then carried the prepared communion wine to the sanctuary. I heard him moving around, setting up for tomorrow's service. After 20 minutes, he returned to the vestry to collect his jacket and keys. As he prepared to leave, he stopped and looked around the room carefully, as if sensing something was wrong. His gaze lingered on the cabinet where I was hiding. For a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to investigate. But then he shook his head and left, locking the vestry door behind him. I waited another 30 minutes before emerging from my hiding spot, cramped and shaking but with crucial evidence recorded on my phone. I had video of Pastor Williams preparing drugged communion wine, along with his own words admitting to dosing congregation members. But I needed one more piece of evidence. I needed to catch him in the act of assaulting someone, or the authorities might dismiss this as an elderly woman's confused interpretation of innocent actions. Tomorrow's service would give me that opportunity. I would be ready with my phone, and this time I would document everything Pastor Williams did to his victims. The wolf in sheep's clothing was about to be exposed, but first I had to make sure no one else got hurt in the process. As I left the church that night, I said a prayer for courage and for the safety of my fellow congregation members. Tomorrow the truth would come to light, no matter how much it hurt our church community. Pastor Williams had counted on the silence and shame of his victims. He'd relied on people dismissing the concerns of confused elderly members. But he'd underestimated Dorothy Richardson. And that mistake was going to cost him everything. Sunday morning dawned gray and cold, matching my mood as I prepared for what might be the most difficult day of my life. I was about to expose a man I trusted and respected for years, potentially destroying the faith of everyone in our congregation. But the alternative was allowing Pastor Williams to continue preying on vulnerable elderly people. That was unacceptable. I arrived at church early and positioned myself in my usual pew, but this time with my phone discreetly set to record. I'd practiced the night before, making sure I could start recording without looking at the device. The service began normally. Pastor Williams delivered a sermon about trust and faith that made my stomach turn, knowing what he was planning to do during communion. "We must have faith in our shepherds," he said, looking directly at the elderly members of the congregation. "God works through those he has chosen to lead his flock." Helen sat 2 pews ahead of me, looking tired but alert. I wanted to warn her, to tell her to refuse the communion wine, but I couldn't risk alerting Pastor Williams to my plans. As communion began, I watched Pastor Williams' pattern unfold exactly as I'd observed before. Young families and middle-aged congregants received grape juice from the silver pitcher. But when elderly members approached the altar alone, he offered them wine from the golden chalice. "The blood of Christ shed for you," he said to each victim, making sure they drank deeply from the drugged wine. Helen was among the first to receive communion. As she returned to her pew, I started a silent countdown, knowing that within minutes she'd begin to show signs of impairment. I was right. By the time the last congregation members had received communion, Helen was swaying slightly in her seat, her eyes unfocused. Mrs. Peterson, who'd also received the drugged wine, was leaning heavily against the pew, looking confused and disoriented. Mr. Garcia, an elderly widower who lived alone, seemed barely conscious, his head nodding as if he was falling asleep. As the service concluded, I watched Pastor Williams carefully. Instead of greeting congregants at the door as usual, he lingered near the altar, waiting for most people to leave. "Mrs. Martinez looks a bit under the weather today," he announced to the remaining people. "I'll make sure she gets home safely. The rest of you go ahead and enjoy your Sunday dinner." I hung back, pretending to organize my purse while keeping my phone recording. Most of the congregation filed out, leaving only Pastor Williams and the elderly members who'd been drugged. Pastor Williams approached Helen first. "Helen dear, you look pale. Why don't you come to my office and rest for a moment before driving home?" Helen nodded weakly, unable to form coherent words. Pastor Williams supported her as they walked toward his office, but I noticed his hands lingering inappropriately on her waist and arm. I waited 30 seconds, then followed quietly. The hallway was empty, and Pastor Williams' office door was closed. I positioned myself in the supply closet across the hall where I could hear what was happening. Through the thin door, I could hear Pastor Williams' voice, soft and predatory. "Just lie down on the couch, Helen. That's right. You're safe here with me." I heard the sound of fabric rustling and Helen's weak voice saying, "No, I don't want to." "Sure," Pastor Williams replied. "You're confused. Just relax and let Pastor Williams take care of you." My hands shook with rage and disgust, but I forced myself to keep recording. This was the evidence I needed to stop him forever. The sounds coming from the office made me sick to my stomach, but I had to document everything. Helen was being assaulted by the man she trusted as her spiritual leader, and she was too drugged to resist or even understand what was happening. After 10 minutes that felt like hours, the office door opened. Pastor Williams emerged, adjusting his collar and smoothing his hair. He looked around carefully, then returned to the sanctuary. I waited another 5 minutes before approaching the office. The door was unlocked, and I found Helen on the couch, semi-conscious and disheveled. Her dress was twisted, her hair messed up, and she looked dazed and confused. "Helen," I whispered, kneeling beside her. "Can you hear me?" She looked at me with unfocused eyes. "Dorothy? What happened? Where am I?" I helped her sit up and straighten her clothes. "You're in Pastor Williams' office. Do you remember coming here?" "No, the last thing I remember is communion. Then nothing." I guided Helen to a chair and gave her some water from the pitcher on Pastor Williams' desk. As she slowly became more alert, I made a decision that would change both our lives. Helen, I need to tell you something very difficult. Pastor Williams has been drugging the communion wine and assaulting elderly members of our congregation. Her eyes widened in shock and disbelief. That's impossible, Dorothy. He's our pastor. He would never. I have proof, I said gently, showing her my phone. I recorded him preparing the drugged wine last night, and I just recorded what he did to you in this office. Helen stared at the phone, then at her disheveled appearance, as the horrible truth began to sink in. He's been doing this to me, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. For months. And to others. Mrs. Peterson, Mr. Garcia, Margaret Foster. All the elderly members who attend church alone. Helen began to cry, but they were tears of rage rather than sadness. That monster. That absolute monster. How could he use our faith against us like this? I helped Helen compose herself and straighten her appearance before we left the office. In the sanctuary, we found Pastor Williams talking cheerfully with the few remaining congregation members, playing the role of concerned pastor. Ah, there you are, he said when he saw us. Helen was feeling a bit faint, but she's much better now, aren't you, dear? Helen looked at him with new understanding, seeing the predator behind the pastoral facade. Yes, she said carefully. Much better. Pastor Williams smiled that practiced smile. Wonderful. Sometimes the Spirit moves us so deeply during worship that we need a moment to recover. I wanted to confront him right there, to expose him in front of everyone. But I knew I needed to be strategic. Pastor Williams was respected and trusted by the community. My accusations would be more credible if I had multiple victims willing to testify and official test results confirming the drugs. As we left the church, Helen gripped my arm tightly. What do we do now, Dorothy? Now we make sure he never hurts anyone again, I replied. We're going to the police, and we're going to bring down this wolf in sheep's clothing. But first, I had to get the communion wine sample tested to confirm what drugs Pastor Williams was using. With that scientific evidence, combined with my recordings and Helen's testimony, we'd have a case that even the most skeptical authorities couldn't dismiss. Pastor Williams had counted on the shame and silence of his victims. He'd relied on people not believing the accusations of confused elderly church members. But he'd made a critical error. He'd underestimated the determination of two elderly women who refused to be victims. The reckoning was coming, and it would be swift and merciless. Monday morning, I called Dr. Sarah Chun at the laboratory where my late husband had worked. Sarah had been a family friend for over 20 years, and I knew I could trust her with this sensitive situation. Dorothy, how wonderful to hear from you, Sarah said warmly. How can I help you? Sarah, I need a favor that's going to sound very strange. I need you to test a liquid sample for drugs, and I can't go through official channels yet. There was a pause. Dorothy, are you in some kind of trouble? Not me, but someone is using drugs to hurt elderly people in my church. I have a sample of what I think is the substance, but I need scientific confirmation before I go to the police. Sarah's voice became serious. Bring me the sample. If someone is targeting seniors, we need to stop them immediately. I met Sarah at the laboratory that afternoon. She examined the small vial of clear liquid I'd taken from Pastor Williams' desk. I'll run a full toxicology screen, she told me. It'll take about 24 hours to get complete results, but I can do some preliminary tests now. While we waited for the initial results, I showed Sarah the video I'd recorded of Pastor Williams preparing the drugged communion wine. My God, she whispered, watching him measure the clear liquid into the wine bottle. Dorothy, this man is a predator. A very organized, methodical predator. An hour later, Sarah had preliminary results that confirmed my worst fears. Dorothy, this liquid contains a combination of Rohypnol and GHB. Both are powerful sedatives commonly used in drug-facilitated sexual assault. The dosage is carefully calculated to cause disorientation and memory loss without being immediately life-threatening. So he knows exactly what he's doing, I said grimly. Oh yes. This isn't amateur hour. Whoever mixed this has knowledge of pharmacology and experience with these drugs. He's probably been doing this for years, possibly at other locations before your church. Armed with scientific evidence, Helen and I went to the Cedar Grove Police Department Tuesday morning. I requested to speak with Detective Lisa Rodriguez, who had a reputation for taking elderly victims seriously. Detective Rodriguez listened to our story with professional attention, reviewing my video evidence and Sarah's toxicology report. Mrs. Richardson, this is very serious evidence of multiple felonies, she said. Drug-facilitated sexual assault, elder abuse, abuse of position of trust. We need to act quickly before he hurts anyone else. What's our next step? I asked. We're going to set up a controlled operation for this Sunday. You'll wear a wire, and we'll have undercover officers positioned around the church. We need to catch him in the act with multiple witnesses and clean audio recordings. Helen squeezed my hand. I want to help. If it means stopping him from hurting other people, I'll do whatever it takes. Detective Rodriguez looked concerned. Mrs. Martinez, that would mean allowing yourself to be drugged again. It's dangerous, and we can't guarantee your safety. He's already hurt me, Helen replied with steel in her voice. At least this time it will serve a purpose. Wednesday evening, Detective Rodriguez briefed us on the operation plan. I would be wired with a tiny recording device, and Helen would also carry a hidden camera. Undercover officers would be positioned as congregation members and in the church basement. The moment we have enough evidence of criminal activity, we'll move in, Detective Rodriguez assured us. You won't have to endure more than a few minutes of his behavior before we arrest him. Thursday brought unexpected news that made our mission even more urgent. Detective Rodriguez called to tell me they'd run Pastor Williams' background and discovered something terrifying. Dorothy Michael Williams isn't even his real name. He's actually Michael Brennan, and he's wanted in connection with similar crimes in 3 other states. Elderly victims, drugged communion wine, the same pattern. How many people has he hurt? I asked, feeling sick. We're still investigating, but we've identified at least 15 victims in his previous locations. Your evidence might be the key to convicting him for decades of crimes. Friday, I received a disturbing phone call that almost derailed our entire plan. Mrs. Richardson? The voice was Pastor Williams, but his tone was different. Cold. Threatening. Yes. I think we need to have a private conversation. Can you come to the church this evening? There are some concerns about your recent behavior that need to be addressed. My blood ran cold. Somehow, Pastor Williams suspected I was onto him. Maybe he'd noticed something amiss in the vestry, or perhaps someone had seen me talking to Detective Rodriguez. What kind of concerns? I asked, trying to sound confused rather than terrified. Just some confusion about your responsibilities in the church. Nothing serious, but it needs to be clarified. Can you be here at 7 o'clock? I knew this was a trap. Pastor Williams had figured out I was a threat, and he was luring me to an isolated location where he could eliminate that threat permanently. Of course, Pastor, I said. I'll be there. I immediately called Detective Rodriguez. Dorothy, under no circumstances should you go to that church alone, she said firmly. This sounds like he's planning to hurt you. But if we don't go, he might disappear before Sunday, I argued. This could be our chance to catch him. It's too dangerous. We'll move up our timeline and arrest him tomorrow. Wait, I said, thinking quickly. What if this is our opportunity? You could have officers positioned around the church before I arrive. If he tries to hurt me, you'll have him on attempted assault charges along with everything else. Detective Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. Dorothy, I can't officially authorize you to put yourself in danger like this. But you can't stop me from going to my own church, I replied. And if officers happen to be in the area conducting surveillance. I don't like this plan, Detective Rodriguez said. But if you're determined to go, we'll be there. You'll wear a wire, and we'll have teams positioned around the building. The moment he makes a threatening move, we go in. Friday evening at 7 o'clock, I walked into St. Matthew's Church for what I knew might be the last time. The building that had been my spiritual home for over 40 years now felt sinister and dangerous. Pastor Williams was waiting in the sanctuary, but his pastoral mask had slipped. The kind eyes were cold, and his smile had a predatory edge. Dorothy, he said softly, thank you for coming. We have so much to discuss. I touched the wire hidden under my blouse and said a prayer for courage. The monster was about to reveal himself completely, and I was ready to face him. Of course, Pastor Williams, I replied. I'm always here to serve the church. His smile widened, and I saw something truly evil in his expression. Oh, Dorothy, he said, moving closer. I think your service to this church is about to end permanently. The sanctuary felt cold and oppressive as Pastor Williams moved closer to me. Gone was any pretense of pastoral kindness. The mask had completely dropped, revealing the predator beneath. "You've been very busy lately, Dorothy," he said, his voice soft but menacing. "Breaking into my office, asking questions, taking things that don't belong to you." I forced myself to remain calm, remembering that Detective Rodriguez and her team were listening to every word through my wire. "I don't know what you mean, Pastor," I said, trying to sound confused. He laughed, a cold sound that echoed off the church walls. "Please, Dorothy, don't insult my intelligence. You took a sample of my communion preparation, didn't you? Had it tested at that laboratory downtown." My heart hammered, but I kept my expression neutral. "I'm not sure what you're talking about. Dr. Sarah Chun is an old friend of your husband's, isn't she? Such a small town. Word gets around when elderly church ladies start having mysterious substances analyzed." He'd been watching me, following me. The thought made my skin crawl. "You see, Dorothy, I've been very careful for many years. I've served congregations in 4 different states, and I've never had problems with nosy parishioners before. But you just couldn't mind your own business." I took a step backward, but Pastor Williams matched my movement, staying uncomfortably close. "The elderly members of my congregations have always been so grateful for my special attention," he continued conversationally. "So trusting, so vulnerable, and so easy to discredit if they ever remembered anything inconvenient." "You're sick," I said, dropping the pretense. "Those people trusted you. They believed in you. And their faith made them perfect victims," he replied with a smile that made my blood run cold. "Do you know how easy it is to manipulate lonely, isolated seniors? They're so desperate for attention, for someone to care about them. A little kindness, a listening ear, and they'll do anything you ask." He was confessing everything, describing his methods with the casual tone someone might use to discuss a hobby. The wire hidden under my blouse was recording every word. "Helen Martinez has been particularly cooperative," he said, watching my face for a reaction. "Such a sweet, trusting woman. She never suspected that her dizzy spells after communion weren't natural." "You monster," I whispered. "Monster." Pastor Williams seemed genuinely surprised by the accusation. "Dorothy, I provide a service these people need. Companionship. Physical comfort. They may not remember our encounters clearly, but on some level, they know they're being cared for." The twisted logic of his justification was more horrifying than outright evil would have been. He'd convinced himself that drugging and assaulting elderly congregants was somehow benevolent. "You're delusional if you think sexual assault is caring," I said, backing toward the altar. "Sexual assault?" He laughed again. "Dorothy, these are consenting adults. The communion wine simply helps them relax, overcome their inhibitions. Many of them are lonely widows who haven't experienced physical intimacy in years. They can't consent when they're drugged unconscious. Details," he waved dismissively. "The important thing is that they feel loved and cared for. Until you came along with your suspicious nature and your meddling." Pastor Williams reached into his jacket and pulled out a small vial of clear liquid, the same type I'd seen in his office drawer. "This is a concentrated dose of the same medication I use in the communion wine," he said, holding it up to the light. "Much stronger than what I usually administer. Enough to cause permanent memory loss. Or worse." My mouth went dry as I realized his intention. He was going to drug me with a lethal dose and make it look like a heart attack or stroke. "People will be so sad when they find you collapsed here in the sanctuary," he continued. "Poor Dorothy, working so hard for the church. The stress must have been too much for her elderly heart." "You won't get away with this," I said, continuing to back away from him. "People know I'm here." "Do they? I told the security guard that you'd called and said you were feeling unwell, that you wouldn't be coming tonight after all. No one expects you here, Dorothy." He was right. In his mind, this was the perfect crime. An elderly woman with a heart condition, found dead in her church, with no evidence of foul play. "Besides," he added, "even if someone did suspect something, who would believe them? I'm the respected pastor of this community. You're just a confused old woman with a reputation for conspiracy theories." Pastor Williams uncapped the vial and began moving toward me with predatory intent. "This won't hurt, Dorothy. In fact, you probably won't even remember it happening. The drug works very quickly." I bumped against the altar, trapped with nowhere else to retreat. Pastor Williams was just a few feet away, close enough to grab me if I tried to run. You know, Dorothy, in a way, I'm grateful you discovered my secret, he said conversationally. It's been lonely, carrying this burden by myself. It's nice to have someone who understands the full scope of my work. Your work. I couldn't keep the disgust out of my voice. 15 years of providing comfort to the forgotten elderly across 4 states. Dozens of lonely souls who experienced love and companionship in their final years, even if they couldn't quite remember the details. Dozens of victims. The full magnitude of his crimes was staggering. And now you're going to kill me to keep your secret, I said. Not kill, Dorothy. Liberate. Free you from the burden of this terrible knowledge. Really, it's a mercy. Pastor Williams lunged forward with the vial, trying to force the liquid down my throat. I twisted away, screaming as loudly as I could. Help. Someone help me. But the church was empty except for the 2 of us. Or so Pastor Williams thought. The sanctuary doors burst open, and Detective Rodriguez charged in with 4 uniformed officers, weapons drawn. Cedar Grove Police. Drop the vial and step away from Mrs. Richardson. Pastor Williams froze, the uncapped vial still in his hand, his face transforming from predatory confidence to shocked panic. This isn't what it looks like, he said quickly, his voice shifting back to the reasonable pastoral tone I'd known for years. Mrs. Richardson is confused. She's been making wild accusations against me. We heard everything, Michael Brennan, Detective Rodriguez said, using his real name. Or should I call you by one of your other aliases? The color drained from his face as he realized the full extent of his exposure. You have the right to remain silent, Detective Rodriguez continued as officers moved to handcuff him. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As Pastor Williams was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at me with pure hatred. This isn't over, you meddling old bitch, he snarled, his facade completely shattered. I have friends who won't appreciate this interference. But it was over. The wolf in sheep's clothing had been exposed, and justice was finally within reach. The news of Pastor Williams' arrest spread through Cedar Grove like wildfire. By Saturday morning, local television crews were camped outside St. Matthew's Church, and reporters were calling every elderly member of our congregation for comments. I spent Friday night at the police station, giving detailed statements about everything I'd witnessed and recorded. Detective Rodriguez told me that the evidence I'd gathered was crucial for building a case that would stand up in court. Mrs. Richardson, your courage has potentially saved dozens of people from becoming victims, she said. This man was escalating his behavior, and we might have been looking at more serious crimes if you hadn't acted when you did. The hardest part was calling the other elderly members of our congregation to tell them the truth about their beloved pastor. These conversations broke my heart, but they were necessary. Helen and I decided to visit Mrs. Peterson together Saturday afternoon. At 81, she was one of Pastor Williams' most frequent victims, though she'd attributed her memory problems to normal aging. Dorothy, Helen, how lovely to see you, Mrs. Peterson said, inviting us into her small apartment. Have you heard this terrible news about Pastor Williams? Some kind of misunderstanding with the police. Helen and I exchanged glances. Mrs. Peterson clearly didn't understand the gravity of the situation. Margaret, it's not a misunderstanding, I said gently. Pastor Williams has been arrested for drugging and assaulting elderly members of our congregation. Mrs. Peterson's face went white. That's impossible. Pastor Williams is such a kind man. He's always taken special care of me when I felt dizzy after communion. Those dizzy spells weren't natural, Margaret, Helen explained. He was putting drugs in the communion wine. That's why you couldn't remember parts of the service. We spent an hour walking Mrs. Peterson through the evidence, showing her some of the recordings I'd made, and explaining how Pastor Williams had targeted vulnerable elderly congregants. The realization hit her like a physical blow. You mean those times I woke up feeling confused and uncomfortable? She couldn't finish the sentence. Yes, I said softly. I'm so sorry, Margaret, but he can't hurt you or anyone else anymore. Similar conversations took place throughout the weekend as Helen and I reached out to other potential victims. Some, like Mr. Garcia, were relieved to finally have an explanation for their mysterious blackouts. Others struggled to accept that their trusted spiritual leader had betrayed them so completely. The most difficult conversation was with Eleanor Watts, the quiet widow who'd found herself on Pastor Williams' office couch several times with no memory of how she'd gotten there. I feel so ashamed, Eleanor cried when we told her the truth. How could I not have known? How could I have let this happen? Eleanor, this is not your fault, I said firmly. He's a predator who used our trust and our faith against us. The shame belongs to him, not to us. By Monday morning, Detective Rodriguez called to tell me that 12 elderly congregation members had come forward with similar experiences. All of them had received communion from Pastor Williams' special chalice, and all had experienced memory loss and suspicious circumstances afterward. We're also hearing from police departments in 3 other states, Detective Rodriguez told me. Once his real identity became public, other victims started coming forward. This man has been doing this for at least 15 years. The scope of Pastor Williams' crimes was staggering. He'd move from church to church, spending 2 or 3 years in each location before the risk of discovery became too great. Then he'd create a new identity and find another congregation full of trusting elderly members. How did he get away with it for so long? I asked. He was very smart about victim selection, Detective Rodriguez explained. He targeted isolated elderly people who lived alone, people whose word might be questioned if they did report suspicious activity. And he was careful about dosages, enough to incapacitate and cause memory loss, but not enough to cause obvious medical emergencies. The district attorney's office called Tuesday to discuss the upcoming trial. Prosecutor Janet Mills explained that they would be charging Pastor Williams with multiple counts of drug-facilitated sexual assault, elder abuse, fraud, and attempted murder for his attack on me. Mrs. Richardson, your recording evidence is crucial to our case, she said. Not only did you document him preparing the drugged communion wine, but you captured his confession about his methods and previous victims. What about the other victims from other states? I asked. We're coordinating with prosecutors in Oregon, Nevada, and Missouri. He'll face charges in multiple jurisdictions. If convicted on all counts, he's looking at several consecutive life sentences. The trial became a media sensation. Reporters dubbed it the communion wine case, and stories about Pastor Williams appeared in newspapers across the country. The case highlighted how predators target vulnerable elderly populations and use positions of trust to exploit their victims. I testified for 3 days, walking the jury through my investigation and playing the recordings I'd made. The hardest part was watching Helen and the other victims testify about their experiences. Helen was particularly strong on the witness stand. She looked directly at Pastor Williams as she described waking up confused and violated in his office, not understanding what had happened to her until I revealed the truth. He stole more than my dignity, Helen told the jury. He stole my sense of safety, my ability to trust, my faith in the goodness of people. But most of all, he stole time from the end of my life that I can never get back. Pastor Williams' defense attorney tried to portray him as a caring pastor who'd been misunderstood by confused elderly parishioners. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. The drugs found in his possession, the recording equipment discovered in his office, and most damning of all, my recordings of his confessions. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. At sentencing, Judge Patricia Hayes delivered a scathing assessment of Pastor Williams' crimes. You violated the most sacred trust that exists in our society, the trust between a spiritual leader and their congregation, she said. You targeted the most vulnerable members of your community and used their faith as a weapon against them. Your crimes represent a betrayal not just of individuals, but of the fundamental values our society holds dear. She sentenced him to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. As Pastor Williams was led away in shackles, he looked back at me one last time. But instead of hatred, I saw something else in his eyes. Defeat. The predator had finally been brought to justice. But our work was far from over. The trial had revealed systematic failures in how churches screen their clergy and protect vulnerable congregants. Helen and I knew we had to do something to prevent other communities from experiencing what we'd been through. The fight for justice was just beginning. 6 months after Pastor Williams' conviction, Helen and I found ourselves in Washington, D.C., testifying before a congressional subcommittee on elder abuse. Our story had sparked a national conversation about protecting vulnerable seniors in religious communities. Mrs. Richardson, Congresswoman Janet Morrison asked, "What changes would you recommend to prevent situations like this from happening again?" I looked at the panel of lawmakers, thinking about all the victims we'd met since coming forward. Mandatory background checks for all clergy, regardless of denomination. A national database of clergy misconduct. and most importantly, training programs to help elderly church members recognize the warning signs of spiritual abuse. Helen leaned toward her microphone. We also need better support systems for elderly people who live alone. Predators like Pastor Williams targeted us because we were isolated. If we'd had more community connections, someone might have noticed the pattern sooner. The hearing was covered by national media. And afterward, we were approached by representatives from the Elder Justice Coalition, an advocacy group working to combat elder abuse nationwide. Would you be willing to speak at conferences and training sessions? Asked Dr. Rebecca Stone, the coalition's director. Your story could help prevent other communities from experiencing what you went through. Within a year, Helen and I were traveling across the country, speaking to church groups, law enforcement agencies, and social service organizations about elder abuse prevention. We called our presentation, Faith and Vigilance, Protecting Our Most Vulnerable Congregants. Our message was simple but powerful. Trust your instincts, document suspicious behavior, and never dismiss the concerns of elderly community members as confusion or forgetfulness. In Phoenix, we met Martha Coleman, an 83-year-old woman whose pastor had been stealing money from elderly parishioners by convincing them to donate their Social Security checks for special blessings. I knew something was wrong, Martha told us after our presentation. But everyone said Pastor Johnson was so holy, so devoted. They made me feel like I was being unfair to question him. Your instincts were right, I told her. Trust is important in faith communities, but blind trust can be dangerous. In Portland, we encountered a situation eerily similar to our own experience. Father Martinez at St. Catherine's had been giving elderly parishioners special communion wine that made them disoriented and forgetful. We reported it to church authorities months ago, said 70-year-old Robert Chin. But they said Father Martinez was just being extra pastoral with seniors who needed more spiritual support. Helen and I immediately contacted Detective Rodriguez, who helped connect the Portland victims with local law enforcement. Within weeks, Father Martinez was arrested, and investigators found the same combination of drugs that Pastor Williams had used. Our advocacy work revealed that spiritual abuse of the elderly was far more widespread than anyone had realized. We heard from victims in dozens of states, describing pastors, priests, rabbis, and other religious leaders who had exploited their positions to prey on vulnerable congregants. The patterns were always similar: isolation of vulnerable elderly members, creation of special religious rituals or meetings, use of spiritual authority to discourage questions or reporting, and systematic exploitation of trust and faith. But we also saw positive changes happening. The National Council of Churches adopted new guidelines for clergy screening and misconduct reporting. Several states passed laws requiring background checks for all religious leaders. Training programs for recognizing elder abuse became standard in many seminaries. Most importantly, elderly people themselves were becoming more aware and empowered to report suspicious behavior. 3 years after Pastor Williams' conviction, we received a call from Detective Rodriguez with news that would bring our story full circle. Dorothy, Helen, I wanted you to be the first to know, she said. We've identified victims of Pastor Williams going back 20 years. The final count is 43 elderly people across 6 states. The magnitude of his crimes was staggering, but knowing that our actions had prevented even more victims gave us strength to continue our advocacy work. There's something else, Detective Rodriguez added. Pastor Williams died in prison last night. Heart attack, according to the medical examiner. I felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that he could never hurt anyone again, but also sadness for all the pain he'd caused and all the faith he'd destroyed. Helen and I attended the memorial service for his victims at a community center in Cedar Grove. 43 candles were lit, one for each person he'd harmed. It was a somber but healing ceremony that brought closure to many of the families affected by his crimes. At the service, Eleanor Watts, now 76 and still working through the trauma of her experiences, stood to address the gathering. I want to thank Dorothy and Helen for having the courage to speak up when the rest of us couldn't, she said. They showed us that we don't have to be silent victims. We can be survivors with voices. After the memorial service, Helen and I walked through the cemetery where many of our fellow congregants were buried. St. Matthew's had closed permanently after Pastor Williams' arrest. Too many painful memories for the remaining members to continue worshiping there. Do you ever regret getting involved? Helen asked as we paused at my husband's gravestone. Never. I replied firmly. My husband always said that evil succeeds when good people stay silent. We couldn't stay silent. We had transformed our pain into purpose, our trauma into advocacy. The elderly members of our community were safer because we had found the courage to confront a predator who counted on their silence and shame. But our work wasn't finished. There were still vulnerable elderly people in communities across America who needed protection, still predators wearing masks of respectability and spiritual authority. As we left the cemetery that day, Helen and I made a promise to each other and to the memory of all the victims. We would continue speaking out, continue advocating, continue fighting to ensure that no other elderly person would suffer what we had experienced. Faith without vigilance is vulnerability, but vigilance without faith becomes cynicism. We had learned to balance both, creating a new kind of spiritual strength that couldn't be exploited or manipulated. The wolf in sheep's clothing was gone, but there were other wolves out there, and we would be ready for them. 5 years have passed since the day I caught Pastor Williams drugging communion wine in the vestry of St. Matthew's Church. Today, I'm sitting in my living room, putting the finishing touches on a book that will tell our complete story to help other communities protect their elderly members. Helen, now 78, sits across from me, reviewing the final chapter. Her hair has gone completely silver, but her eyes still hold the fire that helped us bring down a predator who thought he was untouchable. Do you think people will believe it all really happened? She asks, looking up from the manuscript. Some will. Some won't. But the ones who need to believe it will. I reply. That's all that matters. Our advocacy work has taken us to 42 states and resulted in significant changes in how religious organizations handle elder protection. The Dorothy and Helen Foundation, established with donations from supporters across the country, has funded training programs for over 3,000 churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples. The Foundation's Sacred Trust Protocol is now used by religious organizations nationwide. It includes mandatory background checks for all clergy, regular audits of programs serving elderly members, and most importantly, a confidential reporting system for suspicious behavior that bypasses local church leadership. We've also established a support network for elderly victims of spiritual abuse. Our toll-free hotline receives over 200 calls per month from seniors who've experienced exploitation by religious leaders. Last month, we helped expose a megachurch pastor in Texas whose prayer healing sessions for elderly members were actually elaborate financial scams that bilked seniors out of their life savings. The investigation led to his arrest and the recovery of over $2 million stolen from vulnerable parishioners. But perhaps our most important work has been changing how society views elderly victims of abuse. Too often, seniors who report exploitation are dismissed as confused or seeking attention. Our story has helped establish the credibility and trustworthiness of elderly witnesses. Detective Rodriguez, now retired, serves on our foundation's board of directors. She often tells audiences, "Dorothy Richardson taught me that age doesn't diminish someone's powers of observation or their courage to act. If anything, life experience makes elderly witnesses more reliable, not less." The ripple effects of our case continue to spread. Pastor Williams' conviction led to investigations of clergy misconduct in dozens of other churches. 3 states have passed laws specifically addressing drug-facilitated abuse in religious settings, making it a federal crime to use controlled substances to exploit vulnerable congregants. Most significantly, the case established legal precedent for using recordings made by potential victims as evidence in court. The Richardson Rule, as legal scholars call it, has been cited in over 50 elder abuse cases nationwide. Not all the changes have been legislative or institutional. Personal relationships and individual awareness have shifted too. Eleanor Watts, one of Pastor Williams' victims, now leads a support group for elderly abuse survivors in Cedar Grove. Dorothy and Helen showed us that survival isn't just about living through trauma. Eleanor tells new group members. It's about transforming that trauma into something that helps others. My grandson Jake, now 25 and a cybersecurity expert, has helped us develop a smartphone app called Safe Faith that allows elderly church members to discreetly record suspicious behavior and immediately send evidence to law enforcement. The app has been downloaded over 50,000 times and has already resulted in 12 arrests across the country. But the work hasn't been without challenges. We've faced criticism from some religious leaders who argue that our advocacy creates unnecessary suspicion and undermines the trust essential to spiritual communities. You're teaching people to be paranoid about their pastors, one prominent minister told us during a debate at a religious conference. We're teaching people to be vigilant, Helen replied. There's a difference. Paranoia is fear without foundation. Vigilance is awareness based on reality. Some survivors we've worked with have struggled with the aftermath of speaking out. Sarah Mitchell, a 74-year-old woman from Ohio whose rabbi had been embezzling from elderly congregants, faced ostracism from her synagogue after cooperating with our investigation. Half my community still thinks I'm a troublemaker who destroyed a good man's reputation, Sarah told us during a particularly difficult phone call. Sometimes I wonder if staying silent would have been easier. Easier, yes, I told her. But not right. You saved other people from being victimized. That matters more than social comfort. These conversations remind us why our work is so crucial. Elder abuse thrives in silence and isolation. Every survivor who finds the courage to speak out makes it harder for predators to operate. As I finish writing this final chapter, I think about what Pastor Williams told me that night in the church when he tried to kill me. You're just a confused old woman with a reputation for conspiracy theories. He was wrong on every count. I wasn't confused. I was observant. I wasn't old in any way that mattered. I was experienced. And what he called conspiracy theories were actually careful investigations that exposed his crimes. The most important lesson we've learned is that age doesn't make someone powerless or irrelevant. If anything, decades of life experience provide elderly people with unique skills for recognizing deception and manipulation. Helen and I are both in our 70s now, but we're not slowing down. Next month, we're traveling to Australia to help establish elder protection protocols in religious communities there. The problem of spiritual abuse is global, and so must be the solution. We've also been contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wants to tell our story for a national television audience. The exposure could help reach even more potential victims and educate communities about the warning signs of religious exploitation. Sometimes people ask if we're afraid of retaliation from other predators we've helped expose. The answer is no. We've learned that courage is contagious. The more you exercise it, the stronger it becomes. Besides, we're not the same vulnerable, isolated elderly women that Pastor Williams targeted. We have voices now. We have platforms. We have each other. Most importantly, we have purpose. Every day brings new opportunities to protect vulnerable seniors, to challenge systems that enable abuse, and to transform pain into power. As I close this final chapter of our book, I want to leave readers with this message. If you're an elderly person experiencing something that feels wrong in your religious community, trust your instincts. Document what you observe. Reach out for help. You have more power than you realize. And if you're a younger person with elderly relatives or friends in faith communities, pay attention to changes in their behavior after religious services or meetings. Ask questions. Be supportive. Sometimes the most vulnerable people in our society just need one person to believe them and help them find their voice. The wolf in sheep's clothing we exposed is gone, but there are others. Our job is to make sure they can't hide in plain sight anymore. Faith should heal, not harm. Trust should protect, not exploit. When religious leaders violate these sacred principles, they must be held accountable. That's our mission. That's our promise. And that's our legacy.